Hey guys, welcome to the first Kaldheim limited set review. Today we're going to be going over white. We actually have a co-host, Yanks, which is one of my moderators from my Twitch chat. He volunteered to kind of bounce around ideas, talk about scores, because it would both help me just kind of talk things through. Also, at the end of a set review, I kind of tend to lose my voice, and I have a long week of streaming ahead of me, so it's definitely going to be nice to share some of the talking points with a co-host. So we actually went really long, unfortunately, because this is one of our first times doing this, and we just talked a ton. We talked about all of the different mechanics, so I'm hoping that other colors will be a little bit faster, seeing as how we won't have to go over a lot of that intro stuff. But it actually is about 2 hours for just one color. The next couple of videos we'll do all of the rest of the colors, and we'll try to make our talking points a bit quicker. But I'll go ahead and not make it any longer and jump right into it. Enjoy, guys.
All right, everybody. So our first card in the set, card number 1, Axegard Braggart. It's a 3/3 for a 3 and a white, a dwarf warrior. We don't know yet if the creature types mean anything, so we'll see that as we go. And it has one of the new mechanics from Kaldheim Boast, which in this case reads 1 and a white, untap Axegard Braggart, and you put a +1/+1 counter on it. Boast being means basically you can only activate that ability if this specific creature attacked this turn and only once per turn.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting mechanic because unlike most of these abilities, it's not a mana sink, being able to only activate it the one time. This one, it doesn't really matter because you can only untap it, but I've seen other creatures in the set that are like fire breathing, where you can give it +2/+0 till end of turn. Historically, that's something that you can cast multiple times or pump multiple times, but this is something you cannot. So it's kind of interesting.
Well, actually, one note on the card: untap is part of the effect, not a cost. So if it's tapped, like if it had vigilance for some reason and attacked, you could still activate the ability.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
I definitely will say when I first read any of these cards, I misread what Boast did. I thought it was just raid. From Konzatark here, until realizing that it's specific to the creature. So it's not if any creature attacked, it's if this creature attacked.
Okay, so I did get that. So you're saying that if it was tapped from an ability, you could... How are you getting around this again?
So I'm saying it doesn't have to be tapped to activate the ability. It has to have attacked, but if something else untapped it or if it had vigilance for some reason,
oh, okay.
you could still use the ability because untap is part of the effect, not part of the cost.
Yes, okay, that makes sense. I thought you were saying that there was a way to get around it to do an extra untap without having to have attacked. No. Okay, nope. I completely misunderstood where you were going with that. Okay, yep. Yes. So for a limited card, I mean, it's a 3/3 for 4, which we do see in limited quite often. Dwarf seems like it's probably going to be a pretty popular theme, so we'll have to take a look at the rest of the set before we can evaluate how powerful that's going to be. But I mean, I'm definitely going to say it's a non-zero factor, right?
Yeah, from what I've seen, you've got a decent amount of dwarfs in the set. There's a lot of warriors. I don't know if that's a thing, but there's also a lot of those. And as someone in chat makes a good point, because you can activate this ability during combat, like at instant speed, it's going to attack as a 4/4 if you have the mana.
Basically, if you have the mana, yeah. So, I mean, I'm not going to guarantee that. If you're curving out, right, you might want to be casting something on 5. Or they can blow it up in response, right? If there's any 3 damage removal spells.
Yep, but it has what, I don't know who coined the term first, but it has, threat of activation. So you can attack without playing anything, and they have to assume you can activate.
Yes, that's absolutely true.
And then it gets through because they can't block a 4/4, and then you don't have to activate it.
Agreed. So again, we're getting to the point where we're spending a ton of time on a common, which I feel like I could still talk about this card for like 5 more minutes.
Yeah.
But let's go ahead and give it a rating for limited. Personally, it's one of the better 3/3s for 4 than we've seen in the last couple of sets. Usually it's like scry a few or something that's pretty minimal, but the boast ability seems like it's going to give it a lot of staying power. What do you think?
I've got it at like right around a 2.5. I mean, it's better than complete filler, but it's still a 4-mana 3/3, which is not great stats. They're passable. Ability means it's not dead in the late game, but I'm not excited about the card.
I agree. I think that part of it's going to hinge for me on so yeah, for our records and what I do on the articles is 2 is just filler, stuff that you have to play. 3 is limited cards that you're pretty happy to fill your curve, and then 4 is starting to get to be about a bomb. So for me, this is between a 2.5 and a 3, depending on how valuable dwarf or warrior synergies might be. I think that both of those key terms seem pretty important in a Viking set, but again, I'm not sure because, you know, we'll have to reevaluate some of the synergies of the set towards the end.
Yep, the one other note is that boast, since in most cases, I haven't read the whole set, involves a mana cost, it doesn't stack well. Like having a lot of boast creatures isn't necessarily great because you can only activate so many of them.
That's absolutely true. I mean, it is kind of a mana sink, but something like this where it puts a +1/+1 counter for 2,
Yeah, it's a good effect.
I think that is not necessarily quite the same because you could just use them, you know, pick and choose, and it's got a staying effect on like fire breathing, so I really like it.
Agreed.
All right, moving on. Card number 2, guys. We got Battershield Warrior. My cards are very small. We got another Warrior Human for 3. It's a 2/2, so a little bit low on the stats here for what we typically see for 3 mana. It has Boast. Creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn.
Yeah, so another boast creature right off the bat, another warrior, same mana cost, but this is obviously meant for a go wide deck or a tokens deck, more so than braggart, which grows over time. This is a end till end of turn effect, but it lets you spread wide instead of tall.
Yeah, it's pretty cheap too. We've seen a lot of other creatures in previous limited formats where it's up to like 5 mana for the same effect. Now, to be fair, you don't have to attack for that to be active, so this makes it so you can usually hold back your little guy, pump the rest of your team that is swinging. This actually forces this creature to get into combat, which makes like the whole thing a little bit more unsustainable if they, you know, prioritize it for blocks, but it is much cheaper, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, this is really good for like a single alpha strike. But its odds are it's going to die in the attack unless you have some sort of trick to protect it because they'll focus on killing it.
I definitely agree with that. We're gonna have to take a look at what kind of removal there is. I still say a 2/2 for 3 is a tad bit on the expensive side, but I mean, its ability is pretty good. So if you've got some flyers, a way to give this flying or anything like that, I think it'll definitely pay off in a wider deck.
Yeah, and we're seeing right away 2 cards into white, and not a surprise because white's often like this. Looks fairly aggressive already. Boast by itself is an aggressive mechanic, right? It requires you to attack. Um,
Definitely.
so I think you're starting to see even only 2 cards into the set that there's a pretty good chance white is looking to be, in the one of the aggro colors of the format.
White and limited is aggressive? No.
I know. Who would have guessed?
Never would have thought. Okay. So I'm putting this at like a 2, 2.5, depending. I think it's probably going to be very good in an aggressive deck, but in the average run of the mill deck, I think it's going to be a tad bit on the lower side. If you do happen to make, like, let's say Boros aggro or something, then this could easily go up 3, 3.5, depending. Well, 3.5 seems real high, but what do you think?
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of like the first card, put it 2.5. But again, this is very dependent on how many tokens generators there are in the set. Do you get incidental small creatures like from creatures dying?
Mm-hmm.
They leave behind tokens, that'll help. And
Definitely.
just how good are the aggressive decks in the format? Because your odds are you're only getting this ability once.
So it sounds like we're on the same page. I'm on that 2 to 3 range, depending on the synergies in the deck, and you're just gonna blanket it at a 2.5. I like it.
Yeah.
All right, Battlefield Raptor. This one's yours. Save my voice.
Yep. Battlefield Raptor.
Oh, this one's easy. Dang it.
Simple one. It's a 1 mana 1/2 bird. So it's a bird. So of course it's got flying, and it has first strike. So this is the next in the line of sort of white 1 mana flyers, 1 mana 1 power flyers we've seen in recent sets. We had 1/1, 1 mana 1/1 with flying and lifelink. So it's kind of along
we
the
had
same
the 1/1
theme.
with sort of prowess. It got +1/+1 for historic, but it cost 1 extra. It had first strike, right?
Yep. Yeah, from Dominaria.
So this seems kind of like in the middle. It's got a little extra, but costs 1 less, a little less of an ability. As far as like the other one had first strike as well as the pump mechanic.
Yeah, I mean we've seen these 1 mana 1 power flyers dating back at least to like Core 14 with Suntail Hawk, which is just a vanilla 1/1 for white, 1/1 flyer for white. So obviously this is way better than that. First strike on a 1 power creature is always a little awkward.
I mean,
Unless
it
you have
depends on
ways
the
to pump
set.
it. It does. The fact that that's true. The fact that it can eat on defense, it can eat a 3/1 or a 2/1 without trading is nice.
Or
And
sets
if
with
you
like
have,
saprolings. I mean, I obviously we're in number 3, card
yeah,
3, but the last couple of sets have had a fair amount of X1s as well as token generators.
yeah. Um, I don't know. These cards, I'm never a huge fan of the 1 mana flyers with like slight upsides. In fact, this is a 1/2 that does make a little bit of a difference, but I'm not a huge fan of this card personally, unless we start seeing like an equipment sub theme.
I'm on the same boat with the exception of Bird Jesus, the one that
Yes,
had lifelink. That one was actually kind of a house.
that one was a house. And yeah, sometimes those cards are good based on the just based on the format itself. But um, I don't know. I'm probably looking at this card like, to me, like a 1.5.
Yeah,
I don't
I'm in the same boat.
Again, it can definitely go up. First Strike plays very well with equipment and with auras or pump spells. So if that is strong, I mean, I know we've seen some equipment at rare when looking at the set, but I haven't seen a bunch. I haven't looked too in depth, so that could certainly go up as we if we start seeing a lot of playable equipment.
There's also some other cards like that could potentially want you to swing in. I know, like, what was it? The Guilds of Ravnica had like the spectacle thing, which a bird like this came in very handy. I was always running the 1/3 flyer for 2 just to try to trigger those kinds of mechanics. But again, that's something we can reassess later on in the set. Right now, I feel like this is a 1.5, kind of just a low end filler card if you need it.
Yeah, I agree. There will be some decks you play this card in, but not a lot
All
as
right,
of right now.
moving along.
Yep, I'll take another one since that last one was so easy. Our next card, Beskir Shieldmate. 1 and a white for a 2/1 human warrior, and when it dies, you create a 1/1 white human warrior token.
All right, that's exactly. So this is a couple of things that we've seen in the past for the like go wide token pump spell, right? This plays in very well with an aggressive deck. This is actually a 2-drop where the other one was a 3-drop, fills in nicely. But this is also a 2/1, which is susceptible to our bird.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen these type cards date back to like Doom Traveler, and we had one recently in one of the Ravnica sets that did a very similar effect. You're generally looking to be aggressive, and also hopefully if you can trade this card, you kind of end up ahead because you end up with some incidental value as in terms of a token that gets left behind. So it always has some potential.
Yeah, yeah, the Doom Traveler is the major one that comes to mind, or any of the abilities that made the 1/1 flyers when they died. Well, that was a
Yeah,
specific ability. What was that called?
Afterlife.
Afterlife. Yeah, yeah, that's a whole thing.
Yep. Now this is not a flyer that it leaves behind, which is a
No,
big
no,
deal.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, we've seen Battershield Warrior already as one payoff for going wide. So there certainly seems to be potential for this, but it's a two mana 2/1 that leaves behind a 1/1 is kind of almost standard in limited at this point.
I've also seen a
Pun
fair amount of 3/2s
unintended.
in the format from when I was just kind of skimming through them. So this is probably going to trade really, really well for 3 mana.
Yeah, it is a card that people do not want to attack into if they have to trade because you get left behind with value.
Yeah, and it probably was cheaper than the thing you're eating. So just
Yeah.
pretty good board advantage. I'm going to say this is a decent curve filler for any aggressive white deck. I'm looking at this at like a 2.5.
Yeah, I can get behind 2.5. The one thing I would want to see going forward is, are there more things like the bird that take advantage of it, or 1 damage or -1/-1 effects in the format? But I think for now, I think 2.5 is pretty solid for this card.
Yeah, the nice thing is you don't have to attack with it. Even if your opponent has the bird, they can't then attack with the bird, and it holds back any of their 3/2s. I think it is a solid curve filler, probably 2 to 2.5. I don't think it leaves any. It's not quite strong enough to be any higher than that. It's not as impactful as I would like to see for a limited 3.
Yeah, these are the kind of cards you're pretty happy to see, like if you're drafting come around like 6th, 7th pick.
Oh,
Um,
definitely.
you know, that's usually gonna be a good sign that your color's probably open.
All right, moving right along. Next time, maybe I'll make little pop-ups that show the number that we assign it each time. That'd be kind of fun.
Yeah,
I
that
could
would be
definitely
fun.
do that. All
I like
right,
that.
we
I like
have
that idea.
Bound in Gold. We have a white aura. Typically see those in basically every set. 3 mana. Enchant permanent can't attack, block, or crew vehicles. I did see a few vehicles in the format. And its activated abilities can't be activated unless they're mana abilities, which are the ones that are usually the least important, so that's fine.
Yeah, we had a very similar card like this in Kaladesh when we first had vehicles come out, revoke privileges.
Yep.
Now same mana cost. The big difference, two big differences here. One, it enchants a permanent, not a creature.
Yep.
So you can enchant planeswalkers, for example. Not a big deal in limited, but it's nice to have an answer to that. It's kind of a catch-all to any sort of equipment or enchantment that has activated abilities as well. And also that the other difference from um, revoke privileges is that last part that it can stop abilities
Yeah,
from
so
happening.
putting it
So
on a permanent with a really good ability is really nice. It can also be put onto a vehicle itself, right? And then
yeah,
it doesn't matter like if they replace it or play a different creature that could potentially crew it. It just is if the vehicle is the biggest threat, stopping the creature from crewing it is only a temporary stop. Whereas being able to just place it on the creature and have it not fall off like you typically do, anytime you try to mess with a vehicle or anything that turns into a creature, sometimes they're a little bit difficult, but this gets around that very nicely.
yeah, it just removes like all of the general downsides to your typical pacifism type effect, which are insets with vehicles, the fact that they can continue to crew, and just the fact that they're not good against creatures who aren't trying to attack or block, and that are just sitting there activating their abilities. This gets rid of all of those scenarios pretty much. It's still
Definitely.
vulnerable. It's still vulnerable to like bounce effects or blink effects, like any aura would be. But I mean, this is a very good white removal spell, especially at common.
It also makes sack effects a little bit less valuable. One of the things that you find a lot in limited, especially if you're running like the Orzhov color grouping there, is that you might have creatures or abilities that make your opponent sack, which would make this slightly less valuable as well. You'll run into that sometimes.
Yep, it definitely makes edicts worse, and it is also worse against on the flip side against decks that are looking to sacrifice their own things.
Yep, definitely.
Um,
White removal, I mean, like you were saying, it can be blinked, it can be bounced, it can be all sorts of things to make it go away. So I typically don't value these effects as highly as I would say like just straight black or red removal. So I'm gonna get this into the 3.5 range. What are you thinking?
that's right where I was thinking. I mean, this is going to be your premier white removal spell at common. There's always one in every set. It's always going to be one of your first picks in draft, at least on the commons. Um,
Definitely.
I can't think of a limit to how many of these I would play in my deck.
But saying premier white common removal
Yep.
is not the same thing as saying premier black common
Agreed.
removal,
It's not.
right?
It's agreed. It's not an exile or destroy effect. It does have some vulnerabilities, but it also has some upsides in being able to get after permanents, not just creatures.
A viewer is suggesting 3 to 4 is the limit. I don't know. I mean, I can't imagine you're going to run into more than that, but I imagine it will also be very difficult to find cards to cut over a 5th copy of this.
Yeah, I mean, every card has a limit, but I'd be surprised if I somehow had 6 of these if I didn't play all of them.
I mean,
Depends what other removal I have, of course.
the
But
rest of the deck would have to be pretty bad. I think I'd be happy to run just mono creatures and then mono these.
yeah, exactly.
All right, moving right along.
All right. Next up, we have Clarion Spirit. It's a 1 and a white 2/2, so your stats we're used to. It's a spirit. With an interesting ability. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. So you have a token generator. It's specific to your second spell, so it doesn't trigger multiple times a turn, but it can trigger on each turn, trigger on your opponents as well.
Yes, 2 instants on your opponent's turn is a bit hard to sustain.
It's unlikely in white particularly, but if you're paired with like sort of a blue-white deck that's playing at instant speed with some flash stuff or with instant red removal, it's possible. Unlikely, but there is a scenario where you can get a surprise, flying blocker out of this.
This card seems very aggressive. I could see this playing very well in both like an Azorius type deck where you just want to make some flyers. You've got some draw mechanics to help refill your hand and cast more spells multiple times. But I can also see this in a very aggressive Boros deck. Hypothetically, if you were to like curve out and play a pump spell or something and make a couple extra bodies here and there, it would just be really nuts, especially because we've seen already how aggressive white can be with the pump guy that pumps your entire team for 2 mana, as well as some of the other white flyers and things. I'm pretty excited about this card. For a 2 mana bear that does something amazing, it seems great.
Yeah, I mean, your 2 mana 2/2 is your base stats that you're going to play some, likely play some number of in a deck anyway. And so the ability is just all upside. And the fact that it's creating flyers is such a big deal as opposed to just creating regular, ground based 1/1 tokens. Because you don't need to get a swarm of these to get past people, because you could just get a couple of them. And if they don't have any flying blockers, you just start chipping away at their life total.
Yeah, it doesn't
Even
need
if you're
to
not a super
get into
aggressive deck.
combat.
Yeah.
We're happy to just kind of sit on this, make some dudes, and then, 2 1/1 flyers is a lot in the air.
Yeah, it adds up very fast, especially if you've gotten some early damage in as white. This is kind of almost a form of reach that white doesn't get, like with red sort of burn. This is the way to get those last few points in, maybe if you've been stopped by some big ground blocker.
Yeah, it's great on curve, and it has some really good late game potential if you can keep your hand full, or if you're curving out and then dumping your hand very quickly in an aggressive deck. It's going to help you get that extra reach that you need.
Yep, and a good point in chat that immediately at the very next card we find a card that Bounding Gold isn't very good against. It stops the 2/2, but that ability it's a triggered ability, so that does keep triggering if you get.
It will not stop that from activating, or from happening, because it's not activated, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the best. This card is probably best in either the super aggressive Boros decks or potentially a blue-white deck with some cantrips or cheap instants.
Draw mechanics, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
All right, what are you thinking for this? I've got it in the 3 to 3.5 range. I feel like it has a fair amount of power on the board.
Yeah, I'm gonna say 3 for now, just because we haven't seen enough to see how well this is going to work. How many cheap spells are there in the format? I mean, there are definitely going to be some, but are they good?
Definitely. It's going to have a huge range based on the synergies with your deck.
Yeah, so I'm going to say 3, because again, it's at its very worst, it's a 2 mana 2/2, which is playable to begin. But if you make 1 token, you've got some value.
If they don't remove it, I feel like it won't be hard to get some value out of this. I don't think it's going to be that difficult to trigger.
Agreed.
Even in a limited situation. But again, I do think that, in the right deck, it could go up and be very powerful, especially if you can make use and pump those 1/1s. But in the average deck, you're right. If you're only triggering it once or twice, we're probably looking at about a 3.
There's actually another good point coming out of chat that if on the turn you play this, the next spell you cast triggers it.
That's true.
Assuming you played this first, so you can very easily get that first token on the turn you cast this if you're not playing it on turn 2.
Yes, if you don't want to curve out with it, you could wait potentially for turn 4 or 5, play another 2 or 3 drop, but you'd have to have a very, very aggressive deck with a lot of low cards to really guarantee that to happen, because you don't want to cast nothing until then. It's like, how many 2 drops do you really have?
Yeah, agreed. It's just another little bit of flexibility with when you want to cast this.
Definitely a good point, and possibly worth saving if you want to try to get that value out of it, especially if you're afraid your opponent might just shock it out or whatever.
Yeah.
All right, we got Codespell Cleric, a human cleric. I did also notice that we had another warrior in the past set, so I'm trying to keep track of what the different creature types are. We have a 1/1 for 1. Typically, I'm not a huge fan of those. Let's see what it does. Vigilance, pretty common. When it enters the battlefield, if it was the second spell you cast this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Okay, so
they had to have named these 2 cards intentionally to be right next to each other, right?
Which one? The last one?
Yeah, because they work perfectly together. If you play Clarion Spirit and then you play Codespell Cleric, you get a Spirit and you get the counter.
That's true. Yes, that is 100% true. You play the Spirit first into the Cleric, and then you get a 2/2 flyer, essentially.
Yep.
For 3 mana, you end up with a 1/1, a 2/2, and a 2/2 flyer.
Yeah, it just, those cards are exactly what the other one wants. The Codespell Cleric is cheap. So you can do that even on turn 3. Um, that's a pretty big impact on the board on, say, a turn 3.
Yeah, my bigger concern is that if you were trying to do this consistently, I mean, I'd be worried I'd have too many Codespell clerics and not enough Clarion spirits, and then I'd end up with just like this dirtily hand of 1/1s that are pretty like not impactful on the board.
Oh, don't get me wrong. I don't actually think this card is good. I just think it works. I just think it works very well with Clarion Spirit. And there is a world in with a super cheap aggressive deck where you will want to play one or two of these.
Yeah, I could see that, especially if you end up with 2 of the spirits or something.
Yeah.
Or maybe
I mean,
there's some counter synergies we haven't seen yet. We'll have to see and reassess this. But personally, just as is without a high amount of synergy, I am not on board to play this card. I'm looking at like a 1.5, probably just a 1.
yeah, I'd say one, unless we start seeing a bunch more go wide synergies or more second spell each turn synergies. Because in that case, a 1 mana spell does add some extra value.
Yeah,
But
that's true.
a 1 mana 1/1 vigilance that you can do some work to get a counter, just not. That's there are better things to put in your deck.
I agree. I think the value of this is gonna very much hinge on the play second spells, because this just makes that very, very cheap and reasonable to do. And if it's coming in as a 2/2 for 1 mana, that's actually not the worst. So you are gonna try to guarantee that you do that. Plus, you'll be triggering the second card. That could add a fair amount of value.
Agreed. Yeah, it's got some upsides, but its base is pretty small. Base is pretty low.
All right. So as is, I'm going in the 1 bracket. If there is mass amounts of synergy, I would put it in like the 2-ish bracket. But
Yeah, it's never going to get higher than that. Which when your upside is filler, it's not
yes,
exciting.
definitely not exciting.
Yeah.
All right.
So next up we have Divine Gambit. It is a sorcery for white, so 2 white mana. It says exile target artifact, creature, or enchantment an opponent controls. That player may put a permanent card from their hand onto the battlefield. So this is a very interesting removal spell.
It is. It's a bit scary, but I actually still like it for something late game.
Yes, it has, trying to think the best way to phrase this. It has playability because there are some threats that you do want to get rid of that they are not going to be able to replace with something better. There are bombs in every format that you would be perfectly okay with giving them something out of their hand for. Or late game, they may not have a hand.
I feel like a lot of limited games in the last couple of sets have gone much longer than previous. I've more of my games than not go down to the last card or two, and a lot of times it's the last thing in their hand is potentially a removal spell or some like a combat trick that's not going to matter anyway. You can usually tell when your opponent plays the top end of their hand, and that's the card that you're going to be targeting with this. You're not going to want to cast it on 2. This is more like a turn 15 or 16 removal spell, and I'm pretty happy to even have this in my opening hand and just sit on it knowing that when they play that top card, you've got the answer, which is the fact you're going to do that with a ton of like high-end black removal as well.
Yeah, I wish that this actually just said like non-land permanent, because one place that you would want this is if your opponent has a planeswalker, right? Like you're
Yeah.
probably okay with them putting a creature into play instead of the planeswalker they have out, but this can't target them. It also doesn't have the sort of flexibility where you can target your own thing to bring out something huge, because you have to target an opponent's permanent.
So it's not as flexible as we would like. It's also double white, which is a tad bit hard to cast. But if we're not wanting to play this until, turn 10 plus, that's probably also fine.
Yeah, I think this. I don't know. This card is gonna be interesting to see how this card plays out. It's so risky so often that I'm not high on it. I could definitely see it as a very good sideboard card for people playing best of 3. If
Okay.
you run into a bunch of bombs. And I'm not saying I wouldn't ever main deck it, because I probably would, but I'm not excited about it.
Hey guys, we're getting a really sweet raid from Jim. Welcome, welcome. I got to see a ton of your set review today. It was awesome. Jim talked a lot more about constructed and stuff as well, with some drafting bits in there. So you guys are coming in at the start of our limited set review. We're basically ignoring and pretending that constructed doesn't exist, as we always do in this channel. So welcome, welcome guys. We'd love to have your thoughts and opinions on these. More set reviews, yeah. Draft only. We have one of our viewers actually is co-starring because my set reviews always go very, very long and I lose my voice at the end of it. So we're just kind of chatting, kind of reading the cards to you guys and discussing with everybody what we think of the cards. So welcome. If you have any questions about the channel or the content, don't hesitate to ask. And Jim, thank you again so much. Make sure my viewers click that link and go show Jim some love. He's an absolute sweetheart. Love his content. He's so much fun and a fellow cool stuff sponsee. So you guys will have some really good content over there. All right, so it does sound like I'm a little bit higher on this card, but I'm keeping in mind that you are going to have to sit on this card forever. It's not something you're going to want to be able to play very quickly like you have seen with other cards like Feed the Swarm, right? You can play things like that with a downside much earlier, whereas this is not something you're going to want to do. But I've just had so many, let's say, Selesnya type decks that go super long. They've got a huge top end where your opponents are running out of cards, and I can see myself wanting to cast it because removal in those two colors is just so scarce.
Yeah, I think it's playable in certain decks. Like I don't particularly want this in my Boros deck.
Oh no, definitely not.
I'm trying to win quickly, and they're probably just going to put a big, thing on the ground that's going to get in the way. But the fact that it's basically unconditional in terms of being able to get rid of something, it gets rid of auras. It can get rid of an annoying equipment or artifact. Or maybe get rid of auras by 2-for-1ing them by getting rid of the creature. So I probably would play this card, but it's so scary and it's tough to cast, and I don't want to play it early. I'm probably calling this like a 2.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm definitely a bit higher on it. I'm in the like 2.5 to up to 3 range. I mean, I'm pretty happy to run like 6 mana black removal all the time, and by the time you usually cast that, they don't really have anything left typically. So I just feel like you'll get your value out of it. You might just have to be patient, but I don't really see it too much different than any of that sort of really expensive removal that we see so much in Limited.
Yeah, and I will say I do think this card is probably a little bit better in sealed than in draft because everybody is running bombs in sealed. You're building your deck around the ones you get, and you're probably going to get something. It's a little bit more bomb heavy usually, so
that's
this
fair.
probably is a little bit better of a sealed card than a draft card.
See, I'm thinking if it removes the like from the last set, right, the 6/5 with trample that bounces your lands, right? Like it's just some big top end idiot. They probably don't have anything left, right?
Yeah, they might not.
We'll have to see how this set plays, and it could be that there's a lot of draw mechanics, and then the games aren't going very long. Then this would just be useless. But if it's been like anything like the last couple of sets, then people are running out of fuel pretty quick.
Yep. One interesting note is that it requires obviously the card that they put into play to come from their hand. So if they've used Foretell, a mechanic we'll see on the very next card we look at, and the card is in exile, they can't use that. So if you're running into a deck that's trying to put a bunch of stuff in exile via Foretell, it won't let them use those cards.
Okay. All right. So we've got anywhere between a 2 to a 2.5 to 3 with me. Let's go ahead and check out the next card. Doomscar, we have a board wipe for 5, sorcery speed, destroy all creatures. It also has Foretell. During your turn, you may pay 2 and exile all cards from your hand face down. Cast it on a later turn for its Foretell cost. Oh, exile this card. I thought I said all cards. My screen is very tiny. Sorry, guys. I'm like all squinty. Okay, so you can cast it for essentially the same cost over 2 turns. Is that right?
Yeah.
Are we morphing our spells now?
That's exactly what Foretell is. It's morph for spells. Oh, well, actually, you can morph creatures to Foretell creatures as well, but it's morph into exile instead of onto the battlefield. Yeah, I mean, this card is great. Board wipes are always great in Limited. The fact that you can, if you got nothing to do on turn 2, just exile it, and then you have a 3-mana board wipe at any time you want later on. You can't. One sort of weird thing is you cannot foretell it or use the foretell ability and then cast it that way on the same turn. Um, I'm not sure if you would want to do that, but there might be somewhere doing it that way is cheaper.
Okay.
Um, but you cannot play it till a later turn, and you have to follow all timing rules. So, it's a sorcery. You can still only play it as a sorcery.
Yep, definitely. One of the things I was thinking is there might be some reasons you'd want to foretell, like if you're worried that your opponent's got some sort of mind romp ability, or they can like steal cards from your hand. We'll see more as the set review goes on what kinds of things can interact with your hand, which might be a reason to foretell. But in general, I think board wipes, I would personally, unless my deck was full of foretell, would prefer to not cast things this way, just because it does give your opponent some information. They'll know, like, these are the two colors they're in, these are the foretell cards in the set, what am I playing around? So personally, I think I'd rather just cast it for the full thing on turn. You're not usually wanting to board wipe too much sooner than that anyway.
Agreed. The two things I'd note with this card is, one, it's a rare, so it's hard to play around even with that information. And two, what it really does that's nice if you can play it like on turn 6 or 7 for 3 is it lets you then rebuild the same turn
Yes, so that was
after
the one thing I
casting
was
it.
going to say is if you think you have a creature that you can play, in the same turn, like if it's the 3-drop or something, that might be an exception. You can kind of set it up for a 2-turn thing. But I disagree. I think that playing the card in upside down for the foretell cost will make it more likely that I play around this card than, because like you said, you don't play around rares, but if there's a foretell card sitting there, your brain is going to cycle through what the options are, and I can't imagine there's a ton of foretell in a 2-color set that would be terribly relevant that you'd have to play around.
Yeah, so I'm just scanning through white just because I'm curious. I haven't looked that well. There are 8 foretell cards in white.
Okay, so there's probably 16 cards total, possibilities in your deck.
Yep, plus any artifacts that might have them. I don't know for sure on that, but yeah.
And then you figure a percentage of those are not playable. So
They're not playable or not relevant to play around. It might
if
just
my
be like
opponent is sitting on one card, right? And I'm thinking to myself, am I playing around a board wipe? Most of the time the answer is no. It could be a land, it could be anything, it could be, a removal spell that they're waiting for something good on. Whereas if they show me it's a foretell card, definitely narrows down what it could be. And I believe I'm going to be more likely to play around it.
I do agree. It is foretelling does give information away. I do think you just have to weigh if you can risk doing that here.
Oh yeah, there's definitely going to be situations where it doesn't matter. There's no playing around it because that's your way to victory, right?
Yep, and there is true. You could stick other foretell cards there to make them play around it.
But if I've got a early game board wipe in hand, I'm trying to sandbag it for a little while to get a couple extra cards, I'm definitely not casting it for the foretell cost.
Yeah, that's fair.
All right, guys. White removal spell only costs 5. It's pretty good. Pretty happy to run that in most of my decks.
I can't think of a deck that I wouldn't play this in other than the absolute most aggressive of Boros decks.
Yeah. So what are you thinking?
I think this is like a 4.5.
Okay, very high.
I love board wipes and limited. The foretell, while it could give away some information, is just a upside, right? It's added flexibility. To a card like 5 mana destroy all creatures would already be to me like a 4. So just having that ability to do that, and we may see some things that foretell is helpful for. There also, we haven't seen if there are other second spell turn things where you want it cheaper. Obviously, it doesn't work with Clarion Spirit because you've wiped the board, but there could be some other ones that are not creature based.
That's a tad bit high for me, just because I feel like once you start getting up to the 4.5s and 5s, those are cards that are like guaranteed to win you the game. Whereas a lot of times, if you're hitting this button, it's saving you, but not necessarily winning you the game unless you can set it up and you're not too far behind and you can get that extra value. So I feel like it's not that common for it to be the thing that wins you the game. So it could set you back to even and help you dig your way out, but I don't know if that is always going to be the win. I mean, I still think it's very high. I'm still running it in every deck, but on my scale, I start to put like 4.5s and 5s on things that are gonna basically win. Whereas I think you cast this and you still have a lot of work to do, right?
You do, but I guess I value board wipes high because they're one of the rare sets of cards that is really good when you're behind, which is the hardest type of card to find.
That's true, but does it help you win if you are at even or ahead, it's kind of a dead card, right?
At even you can probably set it up. If you're ahead, it's a dead card. Agreed. Um, but if you're at parity, then you can find a way to set it up probably because you're not under a whole lot of pressure and you can time it well.
Yes, definitely. I mean, like I said, there's definitely possibilities where it can do that, but like I said, you have a lot of work to do, right? You could sandbag the next creature or two you draw, then clear the board, get an extra creature, but it's not winning on its own.
Yeah, that's fair.
Most wipes are dead if you're ahead. Yeah, that's true. But the nice thing is this is a lot cheaper than most. If you're ahead, you're already winning. Yes and no. I mean, if you're ahead, you can't play that, but a creature, like drawing potentially a creature would seal the deal, whereas this is still in this weird limbo area, and then you have to keep it as like an oh shit button, and then they stabilize, and then you have to blow up the world, and then they top deck better than you, and then, if you had just drawn a body or a removal spell, a single target removal spell, then you'd be made. It just depends. Mate, thank you so much for the Prime sub. Really appreciate it, hun. All right, so we've got like 4-ish, 4.5, moving right along.
All right, next is Doomscar Oracle, which I assume is the guy that is predicting the end of the world from destroying all creatures with Doomscar. It's a 2 and a white 3/2 human cleric. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, you gain 2 life. It has foretell for just white, so 2 mana to foretell it, and then 1 white to cast it later. So another one of these second spell each turn triggers effects. It's pretty minor though. Gaining life is nice, but it's usually, unless there's a black white life gain type theme, usually it's not something you're that invested in, or has that big of an impact on the game. But a 3 mana 3/2 with some upside and some flexibility and foretell is always playable.
Definitely. It makes the 1/2. This is one of the cards that we could trade really nicely in with 1/2. The foretell ability in this allows you to cast it for 1, making the next spell, because it's upon cast, not upon resolution, so this can't actually be your second spell. Unlike the other card that has, if this is your second spell, you get this bonus. This won't quite be that way, but it is nice that it allows you to, basically for the same mana cost, make it more likely that you'll be able to get triggers off of your second spells.
Yeah, it's a card that works very well with something like Clarion Spirit, and just go both because it helps it trigger it, and it just then continues to accrue value whenever you do it again later. The little bit of extra value. I mean, I'm not building my deck to try to cast 2 spells a turn to get this trigger, but if I can get it in addition to some other stuff I have in my deck, it's just a nice bonus.
Yeah, it's got the base stats that we're looking for filler, right? 3 mana, 3/2, low to 1.5, depending on the set. I'm not excited to run it. The fact that you can use this, its ability for the second spell is not great, but I do think that you can use it to trigger more important ones, given that it has foretell and you can bring it in basically for 1 mana. So you, for that specific turn, it costs the same over 2 turns, but you can trigger more important things using the foretell. I think is a bigger ability than the actual other text on the card, right?
Agreed. And one thing I really just like in general about foretell is it, as opposed to morph where it costs 3, foretell costing 2 helps to prevent decks from losing that second turn's worth of mana if you don't have a 2-drop. It lets you be a little more mana efficient because you still have something to do with your mana on a turn when a lot of decks, you want 2-drops in your deck, but a lot of times you don't draw one. But this is sort of another 2-drop. It doesn't affect the board, it doesn't protect you against aggro, but it lets you spend your mana on something productive.
So it'll make some hands that aren't very smooth turn to be a little bit smoother, because then they're able to cast that and more on following turns without having just wasted that mana on turn 2, like you were saying.
Exactly. A card like Doomscar Oracle in a hand with 3/3-drops, that's kind of clunky, but now you can foretell this on 2, play a 3-drop on 3, and play your third 3-drop plus this on 4. And it's far less clunky of a hand.
Agreed. Yeah. I definitely can see that. Also, you know, if you cast it in the right order, you get the life gain, which potentially we could be seeing some life gain triggers in the set. We haven't seen any yet, but the last couple of sets have had, you know, even if it's just a minor life gain theme, it's usually there to some capacity.
Agreed.
I think Foretell is going to really smooth out hand a fair amount.
Yeah. You know, it also by making some things cheaper, it helps you get out of mana screw a little bit by at least being able to play some things. It's going to take you 2 turns to do so, but it's better than doing nothing.
I still don't like this much without seeing any like life gain triggers wanting to actually activate this card. I still see it as basically a 3/2 for 3 because you're still casting it over 2 turns. If you have a ton of secondary like spell abilities, then the Foretell will come in handy, but I don't know if that's going to be the case too much in the average deck, so I'm still sitting at around a 2. How about you?
Yeah, I agree with you on 2. I think this is closing on 2.5, but it's not quite there yet.
With some good synergy, I think it can hit a little bit more of a ceiling with the 2.5.
Yeah, I mean, if I have to play this as a 3, much happier playing this than a 3 mana 3/2 with without either of these abilities. Obviously, these
For sure.
abilities are just upside. So yeah, I think right around a 2.
It's got some upside. All right, we have a giant ox. Giant ox crews vehicle using its toughness rather than its power. So we have an 0/6 wall essentially that costs 2 mana and can crew for 6 power. That's not too bad. I mean, I'm not
Yeah,
excited to run this, and I could see, let's say, an Azorius deck where you are having some trouble in the early game racing. You might want some sort of 0/6 idiot. Also, anything with a ton of crew, but I have found in the last couple of sets where we've really thought about crew that that's not necessarily where I want to be.
yeah, I agree. I mean, there are decks that want walls, right? There are blue-white particular decks that are going to beat you with flyers that just want to clog up the ground. And for those decks, this is a fine card. It's nothing exciting. It's it's a wall with a little bit of upside if you happen to have some vehicles. But to me, that's all it is. There's a very limited set of decks that want this effect. And even for those decks, it's not exciting. It's playable.
I'd be interested to see, because you can't crew multiple things with one creature, so I'm interested to see how big the crew requirements are to make this relevant to where you wouldn't just want like a 2/2 for 2 in your deck.
Yeah, I know there was one. There's a 2 mana artifact that has crew 6.
Also, I want
Uh,
to know how a giant ox drives.
especially with its butt.
But that was my next line. You beat me to it. Oh my goodness. How it drives with its butt. Dang it, Yanks. Sad.
But no, there is a 2 mana artifact, Colossal Plow. That's a 2 mana 6/3. We'll get to at a later time. That does have crew 6. Um, so there is one and it's a plow. So having the ox screw to plow is kind of on flavor.
All right. So I'm just going to give this a 1. I'm not pretty happy to run
Yeah.
this in anything. If I have a bad curve or if I'm mostly flyers and I need a little help to get me into a racing situation just to like block their 3/3 so I can, poke them with my silly birds, then that's fine. But in the average deck, I think you're mostly going to be staying away from this card.
Yeah, this is a 1. It's a card you can look at to put in your sideboard against super aggressive decks and best of 3.
Certainly.
But yeah, and you'll know when you want this card in your main deck, and it's not very often.
Absolutely. All right, your turn.
All right, next we have Glorious Protector. This is a 3/4 Angel Cleric that costs 2 white, so 4 mana 3/4. It has flash and flying. When Glorious Protector enters the battlefield, you may exile any number of non-angel creatures you control until Glorious Protector leaves the battlefield. And it has Foretell for 2 and a white. So it's got a giant wall of text on it. So I just break it down, right? 4 mana 3/4 flying on its own. It's a very playable card. Add flash to it, and you're, getting better. Its enter the battlefield ability is interesting, in that it exiles your own creatures, and it doesn't blink them. It exiles them until this dies or leaves the battlefield. So yeah, I guess it can get your stuff out from under auras, like Bounding Gold, and then when it dies, they come back. If you happen to open both rares, I guess you can Glorious Protector all your things at the end of their turn and then wipe the board with Doomscar.
The
And
other
get all your things
possibility
back.
is you could be playing this in response to a removal spell
Yes.
to sort of protect your creature. I mean, it goes away, but then it comes back. They then have to give you another removal spell, bringing your other creature back in, basically fizzling their first removal spell.
Yep, agreed. I think that ability is probably worse on average than just like flickering it, but it's an interesting ability, and it certainly has cases where it's a high upside.
I mean, it certainly is, I think, worse, but it's also a 3/4 flyer with flash for 4.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very good card regardless of that ability.
The other one, what the big serpent that flickers your permanents, right? is basically 1 more mana, plus you have to pay 3 to get it into your hand, plus it's not flash.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this card's great, and we haven't even talked about it has Foretell. So you can for a mana cheaper, you can, it costs you 5 total if you're going to Foretell it, so it does cost you more mana in total.
Yeah, this is the first Foretell where it's actually been more by 1, right?
Everything else has been the same. But it does, again, if you don't have something to do on turn 2, all right, I can stick this in exile, protect it from discard if you're playing against black, and shave a mana off it later if that mana was going to go to waste otherwise.
It also allows you to get around having to pay double white should you be screwed.
Agreed. That actually makes this card a possible splash card. You could not, you generally do not want to splash double white, but you could splash single white. And it's great in response to a board wipe or to anything that kills multiple creatures. So yeah, I mean, I think this card is great. It's got a lot going on, and every part of it is an upside.
Yep, I agree. I'm in the 4.5 range. It's pretty bomby. I think it can win you the game. It's a 3/4 isn't going to win the game instantly. It gives your opponent a lot of room to answer it. I usually reserve the 5s for things that, like, okay, if you can't answer it this turn, you die. Thoughts?
I'm with you on 4.5. I think, this is not what I'm about to say is not a ridiculous scenario, right? You foretell this, you flash it in to eat something as a blocker and protect, and exile something that's under a bounding gold. And then when it dies, you get that back, and you've gotten multiple cards of value, for this one card, and probably dealt some damage in the process.
Yes, I think you're most likely going to get 1 card for 0 out of this on average. Either a bounding gold or a single target removal spell, I think, are the 2 highest, or the, whatever the capture sphere-esque enchantment aura is for blue. I'm sure there will be one.
CGB's preview card?
Oh yeah, I do remember that. Yeah. Okay, that one. Yeah, that was a little bit of a funky one. I do remember.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're most likely getting 1 of those. If you want to be real tricksy, if you've got other stuff you can play, you can then wait for a single target removal spell or a second aura. But most likely, I think you're going to get a 1 for 0 out of this angel.
Yeah, and also, or the ones you mentioned, or just eating an attacker as a flash blocker, also.
Oh yeah, definitely. Oh yeah, if you're eating a 2/2 and flickering your guy, then that's pretty spicy. I like it.
Yeah.
Again, it's not instantly winning you the game, like some crazy god or planeswalker, which is usually what I put the 5s at, but it's very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I would pay 5 or 6 for this effect, because at 4 mana, 3/4 flyer on its own is perfectly fine cost, and then you get all the other abilities.
We typically see something around that range, right? It's the same as the horse that had lifelink and made horses with lifelink when you played an enchantment, similar cost.
Yeah, the Archon. Yeah,
I feel like the Archon was a little bit more likely to get a ton of value if it stayed on the board, but that one had to stay on the board, whereas this one comes into play with the added ability attached to it. But I think the other one had more of a ceiling.
Yep, agreed.
All right, so we are at the 4.5 mark in agreement. Let's go ahead and move on. So we have God's Hall Guardian. It is a 3/6 cat for 6, a bit expensive, but we typically see some sort of big mammoth or something with a huge butt. It's got Vigilance, which is kind of cute, and it's got Foretell for 6, same mana cost, over 2 turns, so you can actually cast it a bit easier, right? Casting it on 4 for the Foretell cost, if you don't have a 2-drop, having a 3/6 on turn 4 with Vigilance is not a bad play.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, without Foretell, I would be pretty down on this card. But with it, that is a huge upside. Being able to get this out on turn 4 is a huge problem for an aggro deck.
Uh,
Having them try to deal with the 3/6 is not easy.
Definitely not. One of the things I will say is that cards like this make it so I've definitely drafted dozens of decks where I'm just like, I really don't feel comfortable with my like early game, my 2 and 3 drops, and I'm very stacked heavy in the 4 and 5s. Something like this could be really, really cute because it kind of does replace a 2-drop in a way and makes it so that way you can recover a bit easier from a slower deck. Obviously not as good as a good 2-drop, but I mean, it does help with, mitigate some of the damage if your curve is lacking.
Yeah, I agree. It helps. It's weird to say that a 6-drop can help with your early curve, but Foretell makes that the case here. 3/6 is a large body, and having vigilance means it gets to attack and block, and hold off those decks, and is going to force some decks to try to 2 or 3 for 1 just to trade it out, and then you blow them out with a combat trick or removal spell.
I imagine this will stonewall a fair amount of decks. So I personally still think it's only like in the filler range. I'm going to give it a 2. I'm not happy about it, but in the average deck, I know you're going to have to run a couple of these if you're light on playables.
Agreed. Same area. It's filler, but decent filler.
All right. Excellent.
And it's a very large cat.
It is a large cat. It's really pretty art too.
Yeah.
All right.
Next we have
Go ahead.
Goldmaw Champion. It's a 2/3 for 2 and a white. It's a dwarf warrior, so more warriors and more dwarves. And it has Boast for 1 and a white, tap target creature. So tappers are always good. This is an interesting one in that it only works in an aggressive context, where most of your tappers you're often trying to use either defensively or be able to activate them twice, like end of turn, untap, activate it again to force through damage. The fact that this has to attack.
Most creatures we've seen have been like that. There was an ox recently and elk that were very similar, weren't they? When they attacked, they got to tap something down.
Yes, they did. White usually has some sort of cheap tapper.
But it's usually in the aggressive context. I mean, we have seen some like just straight pay mana to tap things, but those are usually rare or artifacts. So this is on par for me. I don't think it's particularly weird, and in fact, I think it's actually a little underpowered because usually you get those effects when you attack and you don't have to pay the mana.
Yeah, that's true. It is definitely worse than some of those green creatures you're talking about. 2/3 for 3 is not the best attacker.
Wasn't there a 3/3 for 4 elk recently, like 2 sets ago? You're better at the card game than I am.
Yeah, I believe so.
I'm pretty sure when it attacked, it also tapped something down. Was the gist for free, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the card name, but
not terribly important. But it was a 3/3 for 1 more mana, and it didn't have the mana sink.
Yep, I agree with that. I mean, just like all the Boast cards, the one interesting thing, right, is you can attack and do this before they can declare blockers. So it is particularly good with other Boast creatures if they only have they have limited blockers that can make it so they can't eat your Battershield warrior when it tries to attack.
Definitely.
But and I'm usually high on activated tappers when they don't have to attack, which again don't occur all the time. But I'm not particularly high on this card again unless we start seeing dwarf or warrior themes.
Yeah, I think it's got a little upside with its creature type for sure. I think in a very aggressive deck, this card's going to be very good. It's going to be a 3. In the average deck, a 2, I'm usually pretty disappointed to have in my deck. I feel like this is a 2.5 for me. It's going to have a bit of upside, especially if you've got any removal to pair with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I think I agree with that. I think 2.5 is fine. I'm not going to be unhappy to play it, but I'm not going to be excited either.
Definitely.
Again, unless I'm in the most aggressive of decks.
And its base stats, 2/3 for 3 with a mediocre ability is usually right around where I say 2. I think the ability is a bit better. Not as good as I would like it to be to make me excited to play it, but it's fine.
Yeah. Um, I'm curious to see how many of the white decks are aggressive. I mean, red white is almost always aggressive,
Yeah.
but because Boast is pretty bad in a non-aggressive deck.
I can also see it being very good in like an Azorius tempo deck where you're like bouncing some of their stuff, tapping one thing, getting in some chip
Yeah,
damage.
that that's the sort of thing I want to see is how aggressive are those decks, or how is blue white tempo or blue white control in this format.
Yeah. Real quick, Wretched, I just wanted to say thank you so much. I appreciate the resub. So now we've got Invoke the Divine, guys. Instant destroy target artifact or enchantment. You gain 4 life. It's a sideboard card. It's got a little bit of an upside with the gain life that you see with disenchant usually costs 2, right?
Yes.
So you're basically paying 1 mana for 4 life. It is instant speed. Sometimes they're not. I think this is a sideboard card. There has been a few sets where I've been happy to run things like this in the main board. I did notice that there are sagas, so depending on how many uncommon sagas there are, this might be something you can consider in the main board if you have room. But usually, what was it? It was Theros. I was pretty happy to run this effect because there was a ton of enchantment creatures. But this is mostly, I believe going to be sagas. They're going to be the main target.
Yeah. This is agreed. This is a sideboard card. There are some sets, Theros Beyond Death, Mirrodin, even Kaladesh a little bit, where there are so many enchantments or artifacts that these are main deckable, especially in sealed. But I don't think that's the case with Kaldheim. There are some equipment, there's some auras, but unless we start seeing a huge amount of them, agreed. This just goes in the sideboard.
Yeah, so Jinx is saying there are equips in this set, but like the thing is not every deck is going to have them, so it's not really worth running. Yeah. The only time I want to run something like this main deck is when you're just like pretty much guaranteed to hit a target, even if it's a bad target, whereas I don't know if that's going to be the case in every single deck in this set. So we'll just have to see how many uncommon like sagas there are. I think that's going to be the tipping point for me, because sagas are very powerful regardless.
Yeah, the only thing that stinks about playing this on a saga, right, is it's already gotten some value.
Usually not the best value. A lot of
No,
sagas, when they come into
agreed.
play, are like, gain life or do something kind of
Oh
minor.
yeah, it is not. There are definitely sagas where you want to get rid of them, even after the first one. But yeah, I mean, this is a sideboard card. It's not the absolute end of the world if you have to run this as your 23rd card.
Yeah.
But you don't want to.
Definitely. I'm going to go ahead and give it a 1 for limited. It's
Agreed.
definitely something you want to pick up very highly for a sideboard card. I'm actually going to try to make a grid this time after the fact where it's going to rate the cards, but then there'll be a color associated with it where it's got high synergy for upside or it's got great potential in sideboards. So you guys will see that coming up in the future as well. Right now it gets a 1, but it'll be like a 1 with like a green. It'll be written in green. Anyway, we'll talk about that when I get it written out.
Yep, you want to pick us up for sideboards, or remember that you have it in your pool for sealed, if you need to bring it in.
All right, we have Iron Verdict, guys. 3 mana, instant cast. It deals 5 damage to target tapped creature with Foretell. So the Foretell is pretty interesting. It's the same cost. I do like that. It makes it a little easier for your opponents to play around, but I don't think that's super relevant if they never tap their creature. I guess I'm also pretty happy with that too, if they decide to play around it, right?
Yeah, 5 damage is going to kill most things other than the really large cat butt.
I was going to say, not the cat or the ox butt.
Or the ox. But it's going to kill most things, especially for this mana cost. That's pretty good. Being able to play it for 1 makes it so easy to leave up. If you've been able to foretell it, I mean, this card's just efficient.
Yeah, it's instant speed too, which makes it really cool for the foretell cost, whereas most of the foretells have been sorcery speed or creatures in general, so your opponents aren't needing to worry about interacting with them so much, whereas this allows you to hold open a very minimal amount of mana and use it at a very key moment where your opponent's thinking, oh, okay, well, they foretold this card a little while ago, it's probably a creature, but and then you get them.
Yeah, and this being a common means that it gets really awkward to start attacking into a board with a foretell card and 1 wide open.
I'm always a little bit higher on these cards, like what was the other one? It's usually 4 mana or 4 damage for 2 mana.
For 2, yeah.
I feel like I'm typically very high on them, and I see other set reviews that are usually much lower for destroy target tapped creatures. Sometimes they're sorceries, but the instant cast ones are just so good. 3 mana is a bit tight, but I'm still pretty happy to have this in my deck.
Yeah, also, at least the last couple of one of those 2 mana, 4 damage, like Divine Arrow or Gideon's Reproach type spells were always target attacking or blocking, not tapped,
That's
um,
true.
which is both good and bad. Um,
I
right,
have
tapped
seen a
means
couple other tapped ones,
there
and
have there have there definitely have been. Agreed. Sorry, but the fact that you can hit creatures that are tapped for abilities or that you can tap down with something. Um, on the flip side, it doesn't get blockers. So, uh,
yes, that is true. Like a
you
divine
know,
verdict or whatever.
yep.
Yeah.
So there's pluses and minuses to that.
5
But
damage
again,
is so much for
five.
white.
Oh yeah, 5 damage is great. There's again, there's no white deck. I'm not playing this in. It is going to be worse in your aggro decks because their creatures are not going to be tapped very much. It
Definitely.
doesn't help clear it away, but it's still so cheap and efficient that you'll still probably play at least one of them in your aggro decks in case you run into another one and you're getting in a race or
Yeah.
something like that.
I like this a lot in the Azorius flyer deck because you can kill the larger ground creatures that you're trying to race. More of a Selesnya or Orzhov deck too, where you're more of a mid-game deck and you want to have something moderately cheap to deal with things, or like I said, in some sort of flying race.
Yeah. So this is worse than Boros, but still playable in that and good in all the other white decks.
Yep, I'm gonna give it a 3.5.
Yep, I'm with you. Good removal. White doesn't get a lot of it, and this is cheap and will kill most things you want to kill.
I'd like to give a special thank you to those of you who have signed up for our Patreon. Without you guys, none of this would be possible. This content is also sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc. and KMC Sleeves. If you guys enjoyed the content, consider checking out the links below and using our discount codes. Thank you guys again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.